intention. There is no intention by the people who come to America to promote religious freedom, right? Except for maybe William Penn. There is no intention to do that. It seems to me that most of the development of religious freedom happens by necessity. In other words, you know, if you look at Maryland in 1649, the reason that they passed the Religious Toleration Act is because there were Protestants and Catholics living in Maryland, and they had to get along with each other. And the reason that they did it in Rhode Island is ideologically Roger Williams believed in it, but also there were all kinds of different religious people coming there. And so they had to get along with one another. So this notion of religious freedom that we see in what amendment to the Constitution? Does anybody remember where that's found in the First Amendment of the Constitution? This notion of religious freedom that we find in the First Amendment of the Constitution, we're very proud of. Well, there's friends of ours there. Yeah, we're very proud of this notion. Right? It's even Farron. He's got soup. It's the weirdest thing that's happened to me in 10 years. Right? So, anyways, we're very proud of this idea, but it's something that sort of seems to have evolved, you know, as time passed. Well, back to the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is this religious revival that is a response kind of to people feeling that the religious fervor that had so defined colonial America, and in particular New England, had begun to wane. And who do we associate? What two figures? We associate two people with the Great Awakening. Two people in particular. You studied one of them, Kendrick. You're out of your mind. You just came in and you're answering a question. I'm so happy. Pardon me?
John Edwards.
Jonathan Edwards, yes. And who else? Yes. George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards. And Edwards is more the theologian. And what is the sermon that Edwards, that we all read? Go ahead, Nicoletta. Sinners in the hands of an angry God. Did you read that in English? So you read that in English? Incidentally, all that rigmarole that you did in English will as critical as I often am of it, will be helpful for you on the AP test. I mean, they frequently ask literature questions. Oftentimes, I'll hear the kids talking about the questions. Just, you know, before we go on with this Great Awakening, we got to way late. I mean, they do put you on this like 24-hour like news blackout. I think I told you that before, where they say, Mr. Gibson will say, okay, no matter what, don't tell anybody what were the questions on the test, you know, because, and I told you before, the reason they do that is that some teachers would get all their students the minute they got done with the test, and they would go down and say, okay, what was question 1? What was question 2? What was question 3? But I typically ask the kids, you know, what didn't you know, right? Which I don't think violates that rule, right? I mean, you know, what was I talking? What was that? Oh yes, but anyways, I wanted to talk about something else. What was it?
The English.
Oh yeah, the English, yes. Frequently, and then I'll get back to the Great Awakening. Frequently the kids will say, oh, I knew the answer to this question. You know, one kid says, well, I didn't know this, and it will be a literature question, and somebody else will say, I knew that. And I'll say, well, how'd you know that? Because I didn't talk about it. And they say, well, I knew it from English. You know, so I mean, as much as I hate to admit it, that kind of stuff might be helpful to you. But now, Kunal, back to the Great Awakening. It is Edwards that kind of articulates the ideas of the Great Awakening, that being that people had to do more than just sort of intellectually understand the salvation notion of Calvin. I mean, Calvin sort of suggested that God would pick you for salvation, and then you were picked and good for you, right? And what Edwards said is that is really a miraculous thing. That people are decadent, they are evil, they are sinful, they don't deserve anything. They are sinners in the hands of an angry God. They are like the loathsome spider dangling perilously over the flame, and they deserve to be dipped into endless hells forever and ever and ever and ever. But God chooses to save some of them, and this is a wonderful thing. And then you have to feel this. And then Whitefield comes along and sort of stresses the emotional elements of sort of this religious experience, a conversion experience almost, and you know, preaches emotional messages that appeal to people's emotions, that gather a lot of people and a lot of attention. And the first Great Awakening reinvigorated religious America, right? Reinvigorated religious America. But we also said that the First Great Awakening, resulted in some changes, and one is term 4, a distinction between old lights and new lights. And old lights were those who eventually kind of cooled to the notion of the Great Awakening. This idea that, anybody could sort of preach or teach, and inspiration was more important than education was part of the Great Awakening. The old lights were those that sort of backed away from that and insisted that churches be run by a trained clergy. The new lights were those who embraced the Second Great Awakening. They were the evangelicals. Right? These were the emotional people. A trained clergy wasn't as important as an inspired clergy. Beyond sort of dividing religion, which the Second Great Awakening does, it also provides the groundwork for maybe revolutionary ideas, because, preachers are going to defy, or people are going to defy their clergy. People are going to question the salvation of their clergy. And we suggest that the spirit of sort of dissent that might have been created by the First Great Awakening may have sort of, continued into the revolutionary era. Now, the fifth term is secular. And secularism is not sacred, right? So religion and everything around it is religious or sacred. The secular is the non-religious. And one of the reasons there was a Great Awakening is because of secularism. And secularism, to some extent, was justified by a religious idea called Deism. Now, the reason I bring that up, that's not in your book, but I had this practice test, and it's published by the AP, and I was going to send it down to get copied, and give it to you like later in the week. And so over this weekend that you would have this test, and it's a pretty good test, And so before I sent it down, though, I said, there are terms in here that maybe I could incorporate, into our discussion, and one of them was Deism. And I connected it the best to this notion of secularism, because Deism was a religious belief that God was not intimately involved in the affairs of people, right? That God was like the great clockmaker, and that God has sort of, created the universe, and now it's ticking, and people. He wasn't going to be necessarily involved in every activity of mankind, but he just sort of set things in motion. Now, the notion of Deism sort of allows for secularism. Don't worry about God, worry about the universe, and worry about understanding the universe. And to some extent, that secularism leads into the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is this idea that through reason and science, humans can understand the world that they live in, and they can make it better. Now, when we think about the Enlightenment, what American do we associate most often with the Enlightenment? Yes, go ahead, Amelia.
John Locke.
Well, we could say John Locke, but we'll get him in a second. But typically, yes, Ben Franklin is the example of an enlightened American. Now, let's go down and do John Locke now, Amelia, when we go. And that's from Lost, right? Yes. And let's go down to number 7 when we talk about natural rights. Natural rights is an enlightened idea. It's an enlightened idea that comes to Europe and eventually to America from the pen of Locke and Hume and Rousseau, all lost figures, right? Hume and Rousseau, right? But the idea is that people are born with certain rights. Life, liberty, and property are the ones that Locke argued for. And that the purpose of government is to secure these rights. Governments are established among men to secure these rights. And that ultimately what Locke and others argue is government is a contract between the people who agree to obey the rulers or leaders in return for those rulers and leaders guaranteeing and ensuring those rights. But if you think about it, the power of government in that scheme, this idea of natural rights, comes from the consent of the governed, right? So the governed consent to be governed in return for their rights being protected. And this is an enlightened idea. Now,